Hezbollah still has tens of thousands of rockets. They have an ideology that still focuses on the destruction of the State of Israel.
Hamas isn't finished, is it?
No, far from it, sadly. There's a large amount of Israelis that are alive and in Hamas captivity. We want them all home, and we want to defeat Hamas.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And let's begin with the dramatic events that happened this time last week. A ballistic missile from the Houthis in Yemen on Ben Gurion Airport. What's your analysis of that attack and the IDF's response?
So, according to what the Israeli Air Force made official, very few details. I think it's a lot of operational security here that is at play. But I think we understand that it was some kind of modified type of missile that had a different radar signature that made it difficult to intercept. There were several attempts made to intercept it, at least two. They all failed, and eventually it struck within the compound of Ben Gurion, not far from the road that leads to the terminal itself and very close to the tower. But I think that, luckily we had, 7 or 8 Israelis lightly wounded, one moderately wounded, treated by Magen David Adom.
Could have been a lot worse.
Could have been far, far worse. But of course, this is economic warfare by the Iranians using the Houthis as their conduit to do it. And what really is at stake here is Israel's ability to continue to sustain civilian travel, but also economic activity. And I don't know if it's been quantified already, but I think we're talking about at least hundreds of millions of dollars of damage for the State of Israel, and that's just within 1 week. Massive cancellation of flights. I'm sure that everybody watching, anybody who's been trying to get to Israel or from Israel, has suffered from it. And I think it broadens the dimension of the situation between us and the Houthis and the Iranians, because it brings economic matters into really the center of what's going on. The Houthis are firing missiles that aren't aimed at military targets, which could be legitimate targets, but this is a purely civilian target that has civilian and economic ramifications. Why is that important? Because if we look forward where this will go and what Israel is going to retaliate, so the first retaliation of the Israeli Air Force was against civilian and military targets in Yemen. But I'm not entirely sure that it'll stay that way, because what Israel did, in my mind, was meaningful, but I still would put it down under the column of blowing off steam. They hit our airport, we retaliated, we hit the airport in Sana'a, we hit the port in Hodeidah, a concrete factory in just north of Sana'a, which was very important militarily for the Houthis, but it's not long-term damage in that sense. And I say that it's more blowing off steam than really changing the situation, because if we really want to be honest here and assess the situation with the Houthis, at the end of the day, if you're not willing to put boots on the ground, or if you're not willing to do a sustained, long-term and massive bombing campaign, then the situation with the Houthis isn't going to change. We're more powerful, we have bigger bombs, better planes, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, they're entrenched, they are battle-hardened, and they're willing to take the beating, to take the consequences, as long as it is about an exchange of rockets and missiles. Why is that important? Because at the end of the day, if we want to change the situation, then I think that the address should be the Islamic Republic of Iran and not the Houthis. They, I think, really are the key in this sense. And if Israel will be willing to expand that equation and to really implement what the Prime Minister for the first time said, that we are holding the Iranians accountable for it, if Israel will do that, then I think we will see a change with the Houthis. As long as we won't, then I think that the Houthis will continue to fire at Israel, as they have over the last week.
Since that retaliatory
retaliatory strike, last alarms were Friday. Just 2 days ago, when they fired a missile towards central Israel, I'd say 2-3 million Israelis had to run for shelter just before Shabbat.
Including in the airport area.
Including in the airport area, which gives you an indication of exactly where we are. The Houthi problem will persist until dealt with differently.
And let's talk about Iran for a moment. President Trump and his administration continue the talks, the nuclear talks with the Islamic Republic. What do we expect to come of that, and particularly in the light of Iran's continued enrichment of uranium and missile development?
I think this is a super important topic to make clear, right? There's lots of countries around the world who use nuclear technology for civilian purposes, most specifically energy. Most of those countries, they have facilities, they have nuclear reactors, but they import the enriched material which they use in order to fuel those reactors. Japan, Holland, many other countries around the world, Brazil, that's how they operate. Now, what the Iranians are saying is we want a civilian program and we want to enrich in our own country, and then people get confused about the purity or the percentage of the enriched material. And then the Iranians say, well, we only want for civilian purposes, and that's 3.67% pure uranium. First thing is they have already enriched way beyond that, 60% and above that. The only reason to do that is for military purposes. And what has to be very clear for people is that as long as the Iranians have enrichment capacity in their country, then it's only a matter of time before they will enrich to military grade, and then they will have one pathway to a nuclear bomb. I think that's really where we are now in terms of discussing what is acceptable in terms of the Iranian nuclear program. If they indeed want a civilian nuclear program, they have a reactor in Bushehr. Nobody wants to disassemble it. They can use that for electricity. They can do research as long as it stays without military grade enrichment. And where we are now is that there's pretty clear language from the US saying that no, we are not going to allow any enrichment on Iranian soil, and that we want all of the enrichment capacity disassembled so that there's nothing left. There can be a nuclear civilian program in Iran, and they are totally entitled to it, but nothing that will allow them to sprint towards a nuclear bomb. The Iranians are playing hardball. The Iranians, I think we should acknowledge, are excellent negotiators, very cunning, with a deep, profound understanding of what makes their interlocutors tick, and I think understanding how they can use pressure points and different levers of influence. I think they have a very good reading of the current American administration, what they want to achieve, and they're trying to leverage and to get that. But at the end of the day, I hear more and more American elected officials saying clearly, no enrichment on Iranian soil and a full disarmament and disassembly of whatever enrichment facility is in Iran. Without that, no deal to be made. Now, frankly, I've been saying this, and so have many other experts at FDD. We've been very clear about this, that there's a window of opportunity to deal with the Iranian nuclear military program. That window of opportunity was opened by Iran when they attacked Israel for the first and then for the second time, more than half a year ago. Israel responded, and with using very limited resources was able to almost eradicate all Iranian air defenses. Since then, the Iranians have been replenishing those air defenses, but they are still relatively vulnerable. My concern is that the Iranians are using negotiations as a means to protect themselves diplomatically from Israel taking action.
Waiting it out.
Yes, waiting it out and using that as an effective diplomatic shield. I hope that the US will see through these Iranian negotiation tactics and be very firm and clear. I think this is really at the core of American interest, European interest, regional interest, the Saudis, Egyptians, and others, to make sure that the Iranian regime never ever has the ability to produce nuclear weapons. A civilian program, sure, but enrichment on Iranian soil should never be allowed.
And of course, we still have the situation in Gaza to contend with. Iran-backed Hamas still there. Hamas isn't finished, is it?
No, far from it, sadly. We're nearing that milestone of a year and a half after the atrocious attacks of October the 7th. We still haven't finished Hamas. We still have an enemy to defeat. We still have 59 hostages that urgently need to be repatriated. We're hoping that 24 are alive, even though we hear conflicting reports, 22, 23, 24, but there's a large amount of Israelis that are alive and in Hamas captivity. We want them all home, and we want to defeat Hamas. Now, I think where we are now, looking forward, there's about a month's worth of humanitarian supplies left in Gaza until the situation will start to be really challenging.
But no famine. We're told by many NGOs there's a famine.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that being told almost a year and 2 months ago, that there's famine and there's shortage of food, and it was lies then and it is fabrications now. Yes, there's going to be shortage of food and supplies in about a month. A lot of food and supplies were allowed in during the ceasefire. About 1,000 trucks every day filled the Gaza Strip with lots of supplies, taken by Hamas, controlled by Hamas, and currently those supplies are used by Hamas as the main way to stay in power. That's why they're so important. And I think that looking ahead, probably within a month, we will see a few interesting things happen. One is that the IDF will be tasked by the Israeli cabinet to actually start distributing food, to establish these islands, humanitarian islands, in various locations in Gaza. I think we're talking about 3 or 4 locations based on where the main centers of population are. And they're safeguarding that perimeter, and then through other interlocutors, American companies or UN organizations, start handing out food without having Hamas as part of that process. Now, what that will do, I think, is will generate tremendous resistance from Hamas, because that will be a threat to their control over the Gaza population. To be honest, I mean, even though sadly we've had casualties the last week, several Israeli soldiers have been killed in combat in the southern part of Gaza and in the north, but essentially Hamas is below ground and they're waiting it out. I assess that the moment that Israel will start distributing food, that will be a real rallying call for Hamas, and we will see them emerge out, and we will see significant fighting then. As always, I think we have to be honest about the situation here. The humanitarian situation is challenging in Gaza, but I think that there's a solution to it, and that would be to do what has happened in each and every conflict around the world, and that is to allow civilians to voluntarily leave the area. The Gazans are the only civilians in military history that have been actively prevented from leaving a battlefield. No other war, not before the Second World War and not after, can you find an example of a civilian population that is held hostage by a terrorist organization and by the international community as a whole and by a neighboring country, Egypt. Any other conflict you'll name or that the viewers may want to comment on, that's the situation. Civilians are allowed to flee a combat zone. That's the humane thing to do. That's the moral thing to do. And I think it is extremely cruel that the Palestinians are kept inside. And it's not for their benefit, and it's not out of a consideration for their safety. And I think it's very cruel, and I think that the humanitarian situation could improve significantly if Egypt opened the gates at Rafah and if Gazans were allowed out.
What would it take for that to happen?
I think international pressure. First and foremost, Israel has to be clear that this is what we want to achieve, that this is what we need and this is what we demand, and then a mix of carrot and stick with our relations with the Egyptians, but then to leverage international community and to say, well, this is the humane and the right thing to do. Egypt is an Arab Muslim country. Do you not have compassion for Arab Muslims who are going through war? Do you not think that their safety warrants the founding of a temporary refugee center in northeastern Sinai for people to allow to go out and then to return to Gaza once the fighting is over? I think that the Egyptians are getting away with murder in this sense. I think it's very cynical, and unfortunately Israel isn't communicating this clearly and not saying clearly Egypt should be held accountable, Egypt should open the border, and once Egypt will open the border, that will mark the beginning of the end for Hamas.
Let's look at the northern border for a moment. Hezbollah has been quieter, but again, also not a spent force. What should we read into what's going on right now?
Yeah, Hezbollah was and still is, I think, the most dangerous enemy that we have in close proximity to our borders. And and this pains me very much to say, but Israelis have not yet returned to their homes. Metula, most of the houses there are still destroyed and untenable. Kibbutz Margaliot, Kibbutz Misgav Am, places that you and I have been, and we've taken Stand With Us delegations to it, they are still unpopulated, and Israelis have not been able to return home because the political and military situation still doesn't facilitate that to happen. And I think that's the objective that we have to be really focused on. That is eventually, at the end of the day, what matters the most. If it's safe enough for Israelis to be back in their homes, and sadly, so far it isn't. Now, Hezbollah are in uncharted territory. They're probably in the weakest situation that they've been over the last 20 or 25 years. I see interesting things happening in Lebanon, politically speaking, where the elected officials, president and prime minister, are taking concrete steps in the interest of the Lebanese state to consolidate power and specifically weapons under the control of the Lebanese government, and where they're saying openly for the first time, we're not going to allow this anarchy to continue, where you have armed groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad and others who answer to different masters but not to the Lebanese elected government. And they've said it, and that's been a policy initiative, and I think that's a smart move, smart and brave move on behalf of the Lebanese state. Hezbollah still has tens of thousands of rockets. Yes, they've suffered significant casualties. Yes, their leadership is virtually non-existent, higher military echelon and political leadership. Yes, they have issues with supply, and they have a severe challenge of supplying themselves, but their organizational structure is intact. They have payroll, they have personnel, they have an ideology that still focuses on the destruction of the state of Israel, and we should do nothing but to be very vigilant about what Hezbollah is doing. Last word, I think that Israel is implementing a different policy when it comes to Hezbollah. We have a ceasefire, which more or less is implemented by Hezbollah, the Lebanese authorities, and by Israel. But this time around, what Israel is doing differently, and I think wisely so, is not waiting for threats to materialize and be aimed at Israeli civilians. Meaning, whenever Hezbollah violates the ceasefire, moving into southern Lebanon, trying to salvage weapons or to repurpose positions, the IDF strikes and does so quickly and decisively with clean, good results, killing terrorists without killing non-combatants. And that sends a strong and very important message. But we're not out of the woods yet. And as long as the Iranian regime exists, they, I'm sure, will prioritize rebuilding Hezbollah, and we still have unfinished business in Lebanon.
Finally, within a month, we'll approach 600 days of war. What's your message to our audience as we approach that milestone?
I just came back from a tour of the US, and I'm going in a few weeks. I think that there is some fatigue. There's fatigue in Israel of families that are supporting fighters, reservists and regular fighters who are tired of the fighting. There's battle fatigue or combat fatigue around the world in Jewish communities. Many of them are tired of the fighting. Many of them are tired of the waves of anti-Semitism and animosity that the fighting brings. My message would be that sadly, unfortunately, I think we have to still harden ourselves, strengthen ourselves, and understand that we are not done yet. We will be done once Hamas is defeated, once there is a complete and clear not only victory, but that everybody else, all of the other terrorists, understand that Hamas has been defeated. That, I think, is the first. Once that happens, then we can perhaps breathe a little bit and catch our breath, but we still have a lot of work to do before that happens. And my message would be that we have to continue fighting, that people around the world who care about freedom, justice, democracy, who care about defending Israel against these forces of darkness, they have to buckle up still and continue to fight and to support, whether it is in local politics, whether it's in the media, or by donating resources, time, energy, whatever it is that they're doing. I think it's important that people understand that we are still very much in the battle, and it's a battle that is going to take us time. You and I live in Israel, our kids are serving in the IDF, we have real skin in the game, unfortunately, and so do many, many other Israelis. And I think that our viewers around the world need to understand that we still need the support and that the war is very much still going on.
Important words. Thank you for joining us remotely since October the 8th, I believe. Now it's great to have you in our new studio as well.
Pleasure to be here in your studio, and I wish that truth, good tidings and good news will be broadcast from this studio to the world, and that we'll be able to speak about positive things and not war.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.